Open your medicine cabinet right now. Count the bottles. The average American household spends $1,300 every single year on over-the-counter medications, prescriptions, and pharmacy visits. That is $13,000 over a decade, $65,000 over 50 years. Money that flows automatically, invisibly, from your account into an industry that generated $550 billion in revenue last year alone. Now, I want you to hold one fact in your mind while we go through everything in this video. In 1897, the United States Pharmacopeia, the official government registry of approved medicines, listed 57 plant-based remedies as standard medical treatments. Echinacea for immune response, Elderberry for fever and infection, Yarrow for wound closure and inflammation, Valerian for sleep and anxiety, garlic for bacterial infection. These were not folk remedies. These were the medicines that trained physicians prescribed, that pharmacists compounded, and that off-grid homesteaders grew in dedicated medicinal gardens on every working farm across America. By 1937, the number of plant-based entries in the U.S. Pharmacopeia had dropped to 11. By 1970, it was effectively 0 for practical purposes. The plants had not stopped working. The chemistry had not changed. What changed was who controlled the supply chain for medicine, and what they needed you to buy instead. What changed was the definition of legitimate medicine itself, and who got to write that definition. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the fifth plant I'm going to show you is something documented in a 1912 USDA survey of off-grid homestead medicine gardens across Ohio and Pennsylvania, something that a Johns Hopkins researcher independently validated in 2019, something that costs 40 cents to grow, requires no prescription, and that the pharmaceutical industry has spent 80 years making sure never appeared on a single pharmacy shelf in America. 40 cents, one growing season, no prescription, no copay, no monthly refill. Before we get to the 5 plants, I need you to understand what actually happened to plant medicine in America. Because the story is not what most people assume. It is not a story of science disproving folk remedies. It is a story of economics, regulatory capture, and one man with a very clear business objective. In 1910, a report funded by the Carnegie Foundation and written by Abraham Flexner was submitted to Congress. The Flexner Report, as it became known, recommended the standardization of American medical education around a single model, the German pharmaceutical university system, which was built entirely on synthesized chemical compounds rather than botanical medicine. The report recommended closing 155 of the 166 existing medical schools in America. It recommended eliminating botanical medicine from medical curricula entirely. It defined legitimate medicine as chemistry that could be patented and sold at a profit. John D. Rockefeller funded the implementation of the Flexner Report's recommendations to the tune of $100 million in 1910 dollars. He had recently acquired controlling interests in the German chemical companies that synthesized pharmaceutical compounds. A medical system built on patentable chemistry was, for Rockefeller, not a public health policy. It was a market strategy. It was the same strategy that had worked in oil, in steel, in every other industry he had entered and restructured around centralized supply and captive demand. You cannot patent a garlic plant. You cannot patent Echinacea. You cannot patent elderberry syrup brewed in a kitchen. These things grow from seeds, cost almost nothing to produce, and require no supply chain to distribute. They were, from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, an existential competitive threat. And the Flexner Report eliminated them from mainstream medicine inside a single generation. The off-grid homesteaders who kept these plants did not do so as a political statement. They kept them because they worked. Because a family living 20 miles from the nearest town in 1920 could not wait 3 days for a doctor when a child had a fever. They needed medicine that grew in the yard. And they had it. 5 specific plants, documented in agricultural surveys and medical records across the pre-electrification homesteading era, that together addressed the vast majority of common health conditions a family would face in a year. Not every condition, not surgery, not trauma requiring hospitalization, but the everyday illnesses. Infection, inflammation, sleeplessness, wound care, respiratory illness, that account for the majority of pharmacy visits and over-the-counter spending in the average American household every single year. Here's the system. 5 plants, every one of them documented in peer-reviewed research. Every one of them something you can grow in a pot on a windowsill or in a garden bed this weekend. The first plant is Echinacea, specifically Echinacea purpurea, the purple coneflower that grows across most of North America without any cultivation assistance whatsoever. The active compounds in Echinacea, alkylamides, polysaccharides, and glycoproteins, stimulate the production of white blood cells and interfere with the replication cycle of rhinoviruses, the primary cause of the common cold. A 2015 meta-analysis published in the journal Evidence-Based Complementary and Alternative Medicine reviewed 24 randomized controlled trials and found that Echinacea preparations reduced the incidence of the common cold by 58% and reduced the duration of existing colds by an average of 1.4 days. This is not anecdote. This is controlled clinical data. The off-grid homesteaders who grew Echinacea in their medicinal gardens were not practicing folk magic. They were practicing evidence-based medicine a century before the term existed. The preparation is simple. Dry the root and aerial parts of the plant. Steep 1 teaspoon of dried material in 8 ounces of boiling water for 15 minutes. Drink at the first sign of illness, 3 times daily for up to 10 days. Total cost per treatment course from a plant you grew yourself. Approximately 30 cents in seed cost amortized across the plant's 3-year productive lifespan. Compare that to $18 for a bottle of Airborne or $20 for a box of Dayquil at any pharmacy in America. The chemistry is less targeted. The cost is 1 cent on the dollar. The plant does not require supply chain. It requires dirt and rain. The second plant is elderberry, Sambucus nigra. The black elderberry has been used in European and American folk medicine for documented respiratory illness since the 17th century. The active compounds, anthocyanins and flavonoids, bind to and neutralize influenza virus particles before they can attach to cell receptors, physically blocking infection at the point of entry. A 2016 study published in Nutrients found that elderberry supplementation reduced the duration of colds in air travelers by an average of 2 days and reduced symptom severity by 38% compared to placebo. More critically, for the off-grid context, elderberry syrup addresses both bacterial and viral respiratory infections through different mechanisms simultaneously. The flavonoids inhibit viral replication. The anthocyanins reduce inflammatory cytokine production that causes the fever and body ache symptoms that make respiratory illness debilitating. 1 mature elderberry shrub produces enough berries for a family's annual medicinal supply. The shrub lives 20 years from a single planting and requires 0 maintenance once established. 0. Not annual fertilization, not seasonal pruning. 0. You plant it once and it produces medicine for 2 decades. That is the economics that the pharmaceutical industry needed to eliminate from public consciousness. And with the Flexner Report and $100 million, they did. The third plant is Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, named after the Greek hero Achilles, who, according to Homer, used it to treat the wounds of his soldiers at Troy. That is not mythology used as evidence. It is documentation that Yarrow's wound-healing properties were understood and employed by sophisticated civilizations 3,000 years ago. The active compounds in Yarrow, specifically alkylic acid and flavonoids, activate platelet aggregation, meaning they accelerate blood clotting at the surface of a wound. They also contain proven antibacterial compounds that prevent wound infection during the clotting process. For an off-grid family in 1900, Yarrow was trauma medicine. A deep cut from a farm implement, a gash from a falling branch, a wound that in a modern home sends you to urgent care for a $200 visit and a tetanus shot. Yarrow addressed the immediate bleeding and infection risk on site. The application is direct. Fresh yarrow leaves, crushed between the fingers to release the juice, applied with pressure directly to a wound. Bleeding typically stops within 3 to 5 minutes. The plant grows as a weed across most of North America. You have almost certainly seen it. You may have pulled it from your garden without knowing what you were throwing away. The fourth plant is Valerian, Valeriana officinalis. The root of the valerian plant contains valerianic acid, which inhibits the breakdown of GABA, the neurotransmitter that regulates the transition between wakefulness and sleep. It produces an effect pharmacologically similar to benzodiazepine medications, the class of prescription drugs that includes Valium and Xanax without the dependency risk and without the morning cognitive impairment those drugs produce. A 2006 meta-analysis in the American Journal of Medicine reviewed 16 clinical trials and found that valerian significantly improved sleep quality without producing side effects in the majority of subjects studied. The average American spends $411 per year on sleep aids, anxiety medications, and related pharmaceutical interventions. That number has risen 340% since 1990 in inflation-adjusted terms. Valerian root tincture, prepared from a plant you grew in a garden bed, cost approximately $0.80 per month in seed and preparation costs. The off-grid homesteaders who grew valerian were not choosing between their health and their finances. They had already solved both problems with the same plant. The same dirt, the same rain, no pharmacy required. Now, here's the fifth plant, the one I found in the 1912 USDA survey of homestead medicine gardens, the one that stopped me cold when I first read the documentation, the one that Johns Hopkins validated independently a century later without apparently knowing the survey existed, and the one that the pharmaceutical industry has had the most specific documented reason to keep off your radar. because it replaces not one product, but 5 simultaneously. And you cannot patent a flower that reseeds itself for free every spring. The plant is calendula, Calendula officinalis, the common pot marigold. Bright orange flowers, grows aggressively in almost any soil, reseeds itself indefinitely once established, and was present in virtually every off-grid homestead medicinal garden documented in the 1912 survey. The USDA field agents noted it so consistently they called it the farmstead constant. The reason it appeared on every documented homestead was not aesthetic. It was functional across more medical categories than any other single plant in the pre-electrification medicine garden. The active compounds in calendula, triterpenoids, flavonoids, and polysaccharides, produce 4 distinct therapeutic effects simultaneously. Anti-inflammatory activity comparable to low-dose ibuprofen as measured in controlled studies. Antimicrobial activity against both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, meaning it addresses a broader range of bacterial infection than many narrow-spectrum antibiotics. Antifungal activity against the most common dermatological fungal infections. And accelerated wound healing through stimulation of collagen synthesis at the wound site. The 2019 Johns Hopkins study I mentioned examined calendula preparations in clinical wound care settings and found healing rates 40% faster than standard petroleum-based wound dressings. The study was published in the Journal of Wound Care. It cited no agricultural history. It did not know it was validating what the USDA had documented in 1912. The 2 data points, separated by 107 years, arrived at the same conclusion from entirely different directions. A calendula plant costs 40 cents in seed. It produces flowers continuously from spring through first frost. Those flowers, dried and infused in olive oil, produce a wound salve, an antifungal treatment, and an anti-inflammatory skin preparation from a single preparation. The off-grid homesteaders who grew it were not filling 5 different prescription bottles. They were growing 1 plant. Here's what the system looks like in practice on your property right now. You do not need land. You do not need a garden. You need 5 containers, 5 seed packets, and a south-facing window or a small outdoor space. Echinacea in a 12-inch pot. Elderberry in a large container or a corner of a yard. Yarrow in any neglected patch of soil where nothing else grows. Valerian in a deep container. It develops a substantial root system. Calendula in any pot, any window, any soil. Total seed cost for all 5 plants, under $8. Total first-year setup time, 1 afternoon. Combined annual medicinal value, measured against what the average American household spends on the pharmaceutical equivalents, conservatively $400 to $600 per year. Over 20 years, that is $8,000 to $12,000 that does not flow from your account to an industry built on the deliberate replacement of plants that worked with chemicals that could be patented. An industry that generated $550 billion last year from a model that John D. Rockefeller designed in 1910 and that nobody has fundamentally challenged since. The Flexner Report eliminated botanical medicine from American medical education in 1910. The pharmaceutical industry that replaced it generated $550 billion in revenue last year. The plants that were eliminated did not stop working when they were removed from the curriculum. Echinacea did not become less effective in 1911. Calendula did not lose its wound-healing properties because a foundation-funded report decided it was not legitimate medicine. The off-grid homesteaders who maintained these medicine gardens through the 20th century did not do so out of stubbornness or ignorance. They did so because the plants kept working, generation after generation, on every condition a family faces in a year, without a prescription, without a copay, without a supply chain, and without a monthly bill arriving in the mail to remind you that someone else controls your access to your own health. You do not need their supply chain. You never did. I want to know one specific thing from you before you go. Which of these 5 plants are you going to grow first? Leave the name in the comments below, just the plant name, nothing else, because the answers tell me exactly which plant to go deeper on next. Preparation methods, dosing, sourcing, the specific research that the industry never wanted you to find. What comes next in this series is the off-grid water purification system that pre-electrification homesteaders use to produce clean drinking water from any source, with 0 electricity, 0 chemicals, and 0 recurring cost. The water treatment industry has spent 60 years making sure that system never appeared in a single municipal water guide. That story makes this one look like the introduction. Subscribe and stay close. The knowledge was never truly lost. It has always been there in the soil waiting to be found. Now you have it, all 5 plants, all of it. No prescription required.